All right, well, welcome. This is a discussion about making democracy count, a book by Ismar Volić, a professor of mathematics. And this discussion tonight is co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Thurston County and Olympia Unitarian Universalist Congregation Faith in Action Team, which is how we got this nice forum. I'm sorry? You're here.
Yes.
And my name is John Gear. I am affiliated with OUUC and a member of the League of Women Voters of Thurston County, and who were kind enough to help organize this, promote it, and distribute it. If you do not have a copy of the book, please see Carol, who is holding them up there at the back. It's an excellent, very readable book about a subject that is way too underappreciated, which is how do our elections actually work? And the motivation for this talk is that we can't fix discontent with elections unless we understand how elections actually work. There's a lot of things you might do to elections that would not fix the problems. And it turns out to be a mathematical puzzle. So let's talk about the agenda tonight a little bit. And I just want to say this is a 2-week event. This is Monday night tonight and then next Monday night. And we're going to divide it into two parts. One is voting, and next week is turning votes into representation. So tonight the discussion is about chapters 1 through 7 in the book. I won't ask for a show of hands as to who's done the reading. That's never a good idea. But I do want to have a discussion about voting methods, the first half. And then next week, we'll talk about how we take votes, how we define the playing field on which voting occurs. So this week, we're talking about what voters do when they get a ballot, and then how those votes are counted. Next week is the larger factors that are really shaping the culture today, which is the gerrymandering, the issues of drawing districts, and the ways in which we might approach. If we can't slay the gerrymander, is there a way that we can cage the gerrymander? And that's a fascinating topic. We've already been talking before the event tonight about the Electoral College quite a bit. I'm not inclined, unless it's a strong majority, to want to talk about the Electoral College, because the shortfalls and the shortcomings of the Electoral College are pretty well understood. And there is a vibrant and active proposal for correcting those, which is the National Popular Vote Compact. And I think that if we spend all our time talking about the Electoral College, we will not cover some other topics that are much less appreciated. Does that sound like a plan? Does anybody have anything? Is there anything else that you thought was going to be addressed that you were expecting to hear about? Okay, we have some folks online. We here in the room have name tags, and the folks online, I don't know if we can get a count or see their faces. Let's see if we have a Zoom audience, a Zoom crowd. There we go. All right, so we do have some 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
There are more that aren't showing.
Oh, okay, very good. Maybe a gallery.
It won't let me do a full gallery while we're screen sharing.
I see. Okay, well, I want to welcome the people, especially who came online, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to depend on you to raise your hands if you use the tool that you have on your Zoom to raise your hand if you want to be brought into the discussion. If you don't do that, I will have no idea that you're wanting attention. Oh, I'm looking at there we go. Thank you. Thank you. The side of my head welcomes you. So yeah, please raise your hand. Our excellent tech support team, Carbon, will get my attention and I'll be able to loop you in so you can participate with the rest of us. I really do appreciate your attention. With that, with all that preamble out of the way, is there any questions before we begin? Oh, the restrooms for those of you are right through for those of you who are here and not in your own home, right down the long hallway, the first door as you come in that's not this door, on the other side of the hallway will lead you to restrooms. And of course, if there is a fire, there is an exit there and there's an exit there. Was there anything else? Yes, ma'am. Carol.
So can I just give a pitch for the League of Women Voters?
Yes, yes. We're here people who are interested in elections and voting things.
Great. So let me just.
Please pick up that pencil microphone. It should be powered on already.
Can you hear? Oh, yes, it works. So good evening, everyone, and thank you. My name is. Just one moment. Had to get rid of my gum. Sorry. Good evening, everyone. My name is Carol Goss, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of Thurston County. The League is a nonpartisan political grassroots organization. And for some people, you may think that political and nonpartisan are mutually exclusive, and let me just say, the League has proven that is not impossible, and the League has been informing and registering and working to engage all citizens who want to be informed and involved in our democracy. So having said that, this is I think our first partnership with the Olympia Universalist Unitarian Church congregation, and so I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you and all of you on Zoom. So, and that if you ever want to find out what else the League is doing, please do see our website, lwvthurston.org. You'll see a list of our upcoming events, and you don't have to be a member to join with us. So with that, I'm going to hand this back to John.
And you don't have to be a woman.
And, oh, thank you. Despite its name, the League of Women Voters is for everyone.
And speaking of other preliminaries, one of our attendees was kind enough to call out to me a presentation that might interest many of you. It's called Counting the Vote. And I wanted to know if any of you had heard about that, a PBS special, and I'm getting a nod from Chris.
There was something else on YouTube that was, but it's not PBS.
Okay, Celeste, are you there? I'm keeping thinking that she's on the screen. No. Was it the PBS special or a different one? She may be gone.
I'm here, and it was called Uncounted. Can you hear me? I'm speaking. Can you hear me?
Say it now.
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, it was called Uncounted. or no, counted out, I think. Is that, counted out?
Film was counted out.
It's a film or it's a documentary or what?
It's,
Celeste,
It's a-
did you hear that question? Is it
it's
a
a
film? Is it?
it's a documentary, basically, yes. I'll put the, it's just countedoutfilm.com if you want to see the trailer. I was hoping somebody here had seen it so that I could learn more about it. But thank you for asking the question, John.
You bet. Thank you very much. I have it on my iPad here. There is a trailer for countedoutfilm.com, and the subtitle is Math is Power. So it's certainly a related inquiry to where we are tonight. With that, I want to motivate this discussion a little bit by asking you, both online or here in the room, if you're happy with elections and the way elections work in the United States right now. If you're happy and you think that all is well, please raise your hand. I got one kind of shrug. I didn't see any clear hand raises. I don't know if we have anyone online. You can use the little raise your hand if you're happy with elections and how elections are conducted right now.
It could be better, but it could be worse.
And you have to define where. If you're just taking the United States as a whole, there's all kinds of jurisdictions that do it differently.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, mainly, is that true? I mean, Eleanor, right? Eleanor said that, well, it depends on where you are. All the different jurisdictions do it differently. But do they? I mean, how many kinds of elections, how many ways are there to elect public officials? Does anybody have a sense of that question? A speaker in the rear says lots of them. All right, well, most of us learn to vote probably in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. I mean, do you remember the first time you ever voted? Does anybody? Carol?
Counting grade school, or do you mean no serious school?
Counting grade school. And the first time you were ever asked to vote for your preference? Yes? Do you remember when? Was it elementary or?
Junior high,
Junior high?
yeah,
You elected somebody to class president?
yes.
Yeah. And let me just guess, you voted by listing one name on a ballot and the person with the most votes won the election. Is that? Okay. So that's the DNA of voting in most places in the United States. The overwhelming majority of places in the United States vote using a system that was handed down to us from the British when only the British aristocracy voted in, rudimentary parliamentary elections. And that system is often called first past the post, which says, we might have 9 horses running and we want to know which one is the fastest one. It's the first one who crosses the finish line. That's the one we declare the winner of the race, right? And that's what motivates the coverage, the term for all the political coverage that you hear about media today. You often hear it described as horse race coverage, covering the political horse race. And we refer to it as a horse race because the way we have set up our system is that the first person to get the voting threshold wins the election. But there's no requirement that you get a majority of support. So in a 3-candidate race, I mean, the typical race with 2 candidates, whoever wins has a majority of the vote, right? 2 candidates, you can picture a balance scale. If one has one more vote than the other, the one with more votes will win because they have more weight on their side. But what about when you have more than 2 candidates? The United States, using overwhelmingly plurality, is victim to a very, very common problem in elections from top to bottom called the spoiler problem, right? Do you all know, do you all recognize the term, the spoiler? Okay. I want to stay away from current politics as much as possible, so I'm going to go back in time a little bit, and we can talk about past elections because they tend not to be as heated. Carbon.
We have one person. I'm gonna read their question.
Great. Got a question from...
So, Neil McBurnett says, you don't necessarily get a majority even with 2 candidates. I see you still have your hand up as well. Would you like to speak to that?
Neil, did he get your question accurately? It's not necessary, it is true that you do not necessarily get a majority of all the voters in the population, even with 2 candidates. But it is most common.
I just wanted to emphasize this point because it's so often confused. You know, you can't force anyone to approve or vote for or like anything. And in fact, it might not even be the best thing to encourage quote unquote majority support. So, and just from an election auditing standpoint, it's actually critical to report votes in such a way that you know how many people essentially did none of the above, because that's a very important signal of both whether people understood the ballot and how to vote and how to not overvote and how to, you know, find all the candidates. And also to know, you know, if a lot of people didn't like any of the above. So I'm just pushing it back against the majority language. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack in what you said, talking about auditing ballots and, you know, not forcing people to vote. Let me say that this discussion, trying to walk into the discussion about the dissatisfaction with plurality, does use a simpler case, which is the sort of classic example that you can have we'll use the example of three voters, 3 candidates getting support for a single office. It is frequent in elections in this country that we have winners who might have, you know, as much as only about a third of the support, because you have the problem of, if you believe that and this is perhaps part of the question, is the implicit idea that majority wins. That's something that's based in democratic theory, that the majority should rule. If there is 2 positions, do you go with the less popular position or with the more popular position? Democratic theory says ultimately, if the people rule, if the people are in charge, then even though you can't please everyone, you should at least please the majority. So there is a majoritarian frame around democracy. And so then the next question is, well, who should be the representatives if you're not going to use a direct democracy, if you're going to use representative democracy, who should be the representatives? And then you ask the voting populace, who do you want to represent your views, since we're not going to use direct democracy? And I'm not going to have that, I'm not interested in that discussion about whether that's a better system. I mean, the Greeks used to pick people at random to serve in the assembly. So, that's an interesting approach. And juries who form a kind of an electorate, juries are selected at random, although then there's a biasing or a de-biasing that goes through. But the issue that most presents in this country that causes the greatest amount of angst and dissatisfaction with the plurality or first past the post system is that it struggles badly when there's more than two choices. And so what tends to happen is in Washington, we've sort of resolved that by saying, well, we're going to hold a complete election to see who gets to stand for election, right? We call it a primary, but we have this top two system that says we're going to have a whole election to find the two who are allowed to then run for election. And so we're going to respond to a concern about plurality that it doesn't function well with more than two candidates. We'll say, well, we'll fix that. We'll only have two candidates at the general election. I don't know, is anybody here, I was voting in Washington before we went to top two, and it looks like many of you have voted for years before we went to top two. What's your thoughts about the top two system? Is there?
Got the same problem as it's just down to the primary level that you've got the problem that you're trying to solve.
So Carl responds that it just moves the problem to the primary. Jim?
Well, I think one advantage is that the top two can be from the same party, because before we're a heavily Democratic state, but the general election always had a Democrat and a Republican. Now the top two, it could be that the top two are two Democrats, two Republicans.
And you believe that's an advantage?
I think that's an advantage because when they require that it's two different parties, the Republican might have very low percentage of the vote when he's on the ballot.
So the primary election, oddly enough, the primary election has very low turnout. So, I mean, one response to your comment is, so what you've done is you've allowed a much smaller fraction of the electorate to designate the two who will go forward, and then you said, okay, well, the top two will be from the same party, and that's an advantage to you.
No, it says it can be. By having top two, you can have three choices. Two Democrats, two Republicans, or one Democrat, one Republican. In the previous system, there was always one Democrat, one Republican.
I'm not understanding you because you can only have two candidates in the general election under top two.
Right, and so the top two might turn out to be both Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
But in the old system, you always had one Democrat, one Republican.
And one Pacific Green Party or one,
No, only two candidates.
before top two, minor parties were not weeded out in a primary. So with top two, what we're doing is we've said, we're going to deal, as Carl says, we're going to push the choice back to a much a first round election. We'll still have more than two candidates, but oddly enough, primary votes are low election turnout elections. I've got a question online, I think.
Yeah, those bottom two there.
Neil from Boulder says top two is a flawed system, not enough choices. Yeah, I would agree with that. I definitely don't support top two. In California, turnout goes way down, and undervoting, none of the above, goes way up. I don't think California has an actual none of the above choice. I believe Colorado does. We cannot specify on our ballot, or maybe it's Nevada that does. One of the states, you can actually vote none of the above. Here, we vote none of the above by choosing to skip a race, which is essentially, we can interpret that as none of the above, since it functions as a none of the above vote. And I certainly agree with the comment that when you give people, let's say, two Democrats, there may be a huge number of people in the electorate who feel that I just don't care at this point. If they're both Democrats, I don't feel like I've had a choice in the election, because I can't affect the election with anyone I like. I'm sorry, Sam, is it?
Yeah, I would suggest that the top two is in principle better than the straight first past post, because it does give an opportunity to choose at least two candidates, and then they can go on. However, you pointed out that in Washington, in the primary, not very many people vote. And I guess I would say that's not a fault of the principle, of the idea of top two. It's just the fault of experience. I grew up in the state of Louisiana, which in those times, there was essentially only one party, the Democratic Party. And so Louisiana had a runoff then, as it does now, but all of the candidates were in there, and they were all considered equally, and everybody knew that it was important to vote in that first primary, because that would choose the top two who would be going in. It lasted for long enough that people understood that. And so they voted, lots of people voted in the first primary, and then that would choose two, and then they would choose for both.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about Louisiana. Louisiana is one of number of states who have had a top two system, or excuse me, a two-round system for a long time. There's another question online.
So first, Celeste from Boulder says, I believe Nevada has none of the above. It's not Colorado.
Right.
Would you like to respond to that? And then also, we have Anne, who I will ask to unmute in a moment.
Yeah, no, you're right. I thought it was Colorado for a minute, but then I remembered that it was Nevada that has the literal, you can vote none of the above. And then there's another comment.
Yes, I'm just wondering if it's possible to have a second microphone to pass through the participants that are in the sanctuary so that we could hear them online.
We have that. I'm just not smart enough to operate this equipment. I'm going to ask my lovely assistant, Carol, to try to remind me and hand the mic out. Thank you for... It's already on. We just have to hide it to keep the feedback from...
Well, I just handle all that right here.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So Carbon mutes the mic when necessary. Very good. So let's talk about the the two-round system. The Washington now has a two-round system that essentially functions something like Louisiana. Louisiana doesn't quite have a two-round system, right? If you get a majority on the first round, I believe you're elected, isn't that correct?
I think that's the way it
Yeah.
is, but in principle, if you have a majority, you should win.
Well,
There's a possibility that people would change their mind in the next vote. Sorry.
I mean, it seems that if you do have a majority, that's a legitimate reason for saying that you should win. Now, you could argue that people might change their mind, and so by facing it again, then that could change. And
so in contrast to Washington, where this body is, we have a two-round election where we have a second election even if we don't need it. Right? We can have someone win the primary with 70% of the vote, and we still allow we spend the money to have a second election. There's probably good reasons to do that if you're going to use a two-round system at all. The historical origin of the two-round system in the South is something that's worth attending to. I mean, the origin of a two-round system in a multi-candidate primary, it's quite possible for a minority person to win enough votes to advance to the general. And if you simply use plurality, a one-round plurality election, you could have a minority winning enough votes. So in a number of southern states, they use a two-round system, and the origins of that two-round system was explicitly designed to prevent African Americans from having power proportional to their numbers. And so, you know, the system can ensure that people who are disfavored, politically less powerful, can remain so. There's a hand up.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You were talking about, should you have a second election if somebody gets over 50% in the primary? And the answer, I would argue, is yes, because the primary should never be the decisive election. Primary means first, it's not the final. And in Louisiana, I grew up there. We didn't have jungle primaries. We had jungle general elections. And if nobody got a majority, then we would have the runoff. But it wasn't a primary per se. A primary should not be the final election. Thank you.
Thank you for that. This goes to the issue of, you know, how you design the elections and how you design the ballots turns out to be more difficult than people think. Our grade school understanding of let's everybody just vote for the favorite pizza, or let's everybody just vote for the class president, and we'll just tally up, you know, we'll have 4 people go up to the front of the room and everybody can vote for them using a, you know, vote for one only. That's the classic American election. You vote for one only. With the advent of parties, we ended up developing primaries, and primaries really were not to be elections, as the commenter, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name. The commenter said primary is not to be the general election. The purpose of a primary has historically been to have a party select a candidate to represent that party. I mean, that's That's why you needed primary elections. What happened in many places is you had one-party states, and you had primaries where winning the primary was tantamount to winning the general election. And that's where we are in many of the states in this country now. How many of you have heard the term the Great Sort? The Great Sorting. People are sorting themselves out, and we're, rather than melding into a broad purple country, people are dividing themselves, and we have more and more states and more districts within states that are seriously weighted to one of the dominant parties or the other. They are one-party fiefdoms. Detroit is an overwhelmingly Democratic city. Much of Wayne County is overwhelmingly Republican around Detroit. And the Democrats, a huge number of Democrats waste their votes in Detroit because their vote doesn't matter. I mean, the measure that mathematicians use about voting power is to decide whether a voter has power. Does the voter have the ability to influence the outcome of the election? And if you're in a deep red state and you're a red voter, you have almost no ability to affect the election. Your vote is meaningless. And of course, if you're in the minority party, if you're a Republican in Detroit, you have essentially no power to influence the election at all.
That argument makes me really uncomfortable, because it's essentially an argument in favor of not voting.
So Carl says he's uncomfortable with that argument because,
I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong, actually, but what's the point of saying it? Because all it does is tell people, you might as well not vote. And in addition to which, you can say, well, Democratic voters in the state of Washington are wasted voters. I'm not ready to articulate exactly what I don't like about that. But every voter in every district in the long run matters. Because if everybody starts believing, well, if there's a lot of Democrats here, I might as well not vote, then pretty soon a lot of Democrats won't vote. And then the Republicans will win, or whatever other party. I mean, you see this a lot about wasting your vote, and these few swing states, they decide the election. They don't decide the election. If a whole bunch of Democrats in Washington decide not to vote, pretty soon Washington's electoral votes will go to Republicans. Every voter is important, because if they start thinking they're not important, that'll swing an election the other way.
I have to think about that. I appreciate what you're saying about all votes matter, but and we only vote statewide in one election. There's only one election, which is a very unusual election, the presidential election.
The governor is statewide, the attorney general is statewide.
But the comment about wasted votes that comes up in the context of the majority wasting their votes, it comes up in the context of it comes up mostly in the context of the Electoral College being mediated through millions of extra votes on one side that don't influence the outcome at all. So,
I mean, you can say the people who vote for the loser didn't influence the election. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I think it's looking at things from the wrong angle.
let me come back next week and try to put that in more careful terms, because I appreciate what you're saying about, no vote is wasted if it's honestly cast and, honestly counted, right? I mean, you've done your job as a citizen if you show up and vote. What I can tell you is that there's many, many people and much significant research about people who do feel that their vote is wasted. It's not a comment that other people make about their vote. It's that they feel their vote is wasted because it has no power. They are either trapped in a district that doesn't represent them, or they feel like in some cases, they are trapped in an overwhelmingly district that then their vote couldn't be useful to choosing the winner.
But what that is a message to them that you should try to convert people to your side.
You're talking mathematics. I don't see you talking mathematics. I see you talking emotional, psychological.
I'm talking about the real world. I'm talking about the real world, how it works.
I see it as a mathematical discussion from your side.
Well, I was a math major and went to graduate school in math, so I appreciate math.
But you've got a true heart as a patriot to this country. You got a true heart as a patriot to this country, which is valued by all of us. But I see this book and the breakdown of the discussion of how mathematics figures into our voting systems as an isolated, I won't say esoteric, but in my view, discussions. And I think it needs to be separated out at some point.
Let me try to reel this back in from the discussion about wasted votes. I appreciate your comment and the intent of your comment about wasted votes to the extent I think I understand it. But the measurement, the mathematical measurement of voter power is a very significant one for discussions, particularly like of gerrymandering, which is a problem that we're going to discuss next week. And that's really where this discussion should probably go, is under the gerrymandering discussion. Because voter power is a very useful tool for understanding how to gerrymander or how to fight the gerrymander. So, and that doesn't happen at the state level. You can't gerrymander a state, right? Whether you're electing a governor or a senator or a president, the people who choose to live and vote in that state, they're not divided up in any artificial way. There was another question over here, and you have the mic, Sam?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what two or three people have said here. Back to the situation with the Electoral College. Everybody in the country has some effect on the outcome, but their power, which is what you've mentioned, is essentially the probability that their vote could make the difference. And it would have to make the difference in their state, and then their state would have to be pivotal nationally. And if you are in a state which is heavily one way or the other, California or it's Alabama, then your probability of being the decisive vote in that state is very low. But if you're in Pennsylvania, then your probability that you will be the decisive vote in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania will be the decisive vote in the country, is relatively high. And that sort of distinction can be made. And that's why, of course, both of the major candidates are spending an enormous percent of their time in those 7 states that are really close.
An enormous percent of their time, I would call 100%. I mean, the election is, we have a national election going on right now that is basically coming down to a tiny handful of counties in a tiny number of states. and the candidates are freed of any chance or obligation, really, to seek votes elsewhere. There's another comment online, and we are getting pulled inexorably into the Electoral College, I'm afraid.
So, shall we call this the last question on this topic?
I hope so.
All right. So, Neil McBurnett from Boulder says, I think the discussion of wasted votes should go under the proportional representation section, which also eliminates gerrymandering. And then also, PR does an excellent job of helping as many votes count as possible by making the legislative body reflect the views of the electorate as much as possible.
Well, God bless you, or Goddess bless you, because you're ahead of me, but that's where we're going. I mean, you know, my subversive intent of doing this workshop and doing this discussion is to help people understand that there is a better way. And we do have a better option. And for most of our elections, in fact, all of the elections that we could talk about, except for that one that gets all our attention, we have in our grasp both the tools and the knowledge and the motivation to use a better way to elect. There are better ways to elect. And the main problem is that in America, we simply don't know about them. Because the fish doesn't understand the water that the fish swims through. It's just there. And we've always been, since we were this tall, we've always been doing elections the same way. Everybody votes, they throw one name down, and then whoever gets the most votes wins. Turns out that's a really poor way to elect candidates. And it's got terrible problems. The one virtue that it has, the virtue of plurality is its simplicity, and everybody is familiar with it. I mean, but that was the argument for leeches in the 17th century. I mean, honestly, there is not a single field of human endeavor that you can name that has not advanced since the 1700s, except for voting. We have, in America, in fact, I'll qualify that by saying in America, because in every other country, every country that has had the opportunity to rethink and reformulate its election systems has taken advantage of the advances since 1700. We have not. And it's odd because many of the advances, if you read the chapter on preference voting really is an American invention. But we simply haven't used it. There's a lot of reasons for that. We've had a tremendous history with preference voting is the term for ranked choice voting. There's a robust history of ranked choice voting in this country, and under the name preference voting. Oregon has preference voting in its constitution. The Constitution expressly allows Oregon jurisdictions to use preference voting. Unlike Washington, which has taken control of all local elections and has prevented the top two system in Washington expressly prohibits local elections from using anything other than top two. So we have bought into a system and we have standardized the system and said, like it or lump it, you're going to use it, which is is problematic. We have to get rid of this one-size-fits-all election rule and allow voters experience with other methods so that they can choose maybe to use a better system that leads to better results. So on the board, and I believe everybody online should have been sent the slides. It's not a very elaborate slide. I assume that people did the reading, but it simply lists on one side 3 ordinal methods of voting or counting votes, and the other 2 non-ordinal methods. And when I say ordinal method, I mean you rank the choices in order. And I put plurality there because plurality is rank your choices in order up to 1. I mean, it is a truncated ranked ballot. You're only allowed to express your preference for the most favored candidate. And if you are in isolation, if you're a person in space who is prevented from knowing anything about the rest of the electors, you would probably vote for your favorite, right? If you're in the space station and you haven't had any exposure to news about the election and any results about polling, you would say, well, I like this person the best and I'll vote for them. But if you know about how the election results are going in that plurality election, what's the first thing you think about when you're ready to cast your vote for that minor party candidate? I'm seeing nodding. What are we talking about here? We're talking about splitting votes and spoiling, right? If I vote for my favorite, am I going to get the one I most dislike? That's the voter's conundrum with a plurality vote. Because you only got to say what your most preferred option was, you may have to revise your most preferred option, because the pain of helping elect the wrong candidate feels worse to you than the privilege or the pleasure you would get from helping elect the right one. If you cast your vote for Ross Perot, let's say if you cast your vote for Ross Perot, are you helping elect Bill Clinton, who you despise? That was a choice that many voters faced. And many, many more votes. In election after election, we know that many people support minor party candidates right up until they close the voting booth, the metaphorical voting booth. We got rid of that with top 2, but then we're back in the primary. And we say, okay, let's talk, the one race we can talk about that's local and current is the State Lands Commissioner, because it provides a really good example of the struggles we have with plurality voting. There were 5 people affiliated with the Democratic Party who were running in the primary for State Lands Commissioner against one very well-known Republican. Was there 1 or 2 Republicans? There were 2 Republicans. One was very well-known, a former Congresswoman, and a second Republican, and then I think there was a slew of others. Yeah. So what you had was 5 Democratic candidates, an overwhelming amount of, a fairly overwhelming amount of Democratic support that nearly produced no Democratic candidate at all.
56 votes difference.
So that is one of the major rejoinders to your comment about preferring top 2, is that it can produce this pathological result where by supporting your favorite Democrats, if you were of that persuasion, you could end up seeing a top 2 with 2 Republicans. So that's a pathological result. That is a result that is nowhere contemplated in democratic theory, that your that the majority support for blue candidates should produce a second round election of only red candidates. So that is a wonderful example of why top two probably needs to be rethought completely, but also it's an inherent flaw in plurality. We could do this, and if you've read the book on the chapter on ranked choice voting, there is a better way, and it's well understood. We could simply rank the candidates in order of preference, and then if you were a committed Democrat, you could vote for the 5 Democrats in whatever order you like, confident that you weren't going to be helping a Republican essentially get your vote from you. Turns out, and this is we've been going almost an hour, so I'm going to leave this comment and then we're going to have a break and then we'll pick up again. Turns out that ranked choice voting or preference voting isn't perfect either. And much of the first 6 chapters goes to the basically proving to you that there ain't no good way to elect people. No perfect way, but there is a worst way. And we used it, baby. So, Carmen, if you'll throw up the last slide, and for those at home or for those here, there's a wonderful, wonderful example. It's a very contrived example. I mean, it was, it was created to make this point, but it is it is not, how do I say this? It was a contrived example that makes a point, but it's not an artificial example. This is how elections go wrong under different rules of counting. All methods of scheduling votes in a preference order are vulnerable to these paradoxes and foibles. There's no perfect system. After the break, we'll talk about non-ordinal systems, the very popular range and approval voting, and then I want to spend the last section talking a little bit about why I agree with Volić that of the imperfect systems, there is a best. It's not a perfect system, and you can make good faith arguments for every one of the systems. Even plurality has some defenders. And there are people who will argue against a conclusion that I make and that Volić makes here in this book in favor of ranked choice voting. I want to talk about what makes so many people convinced that ranked choice voting is the answer. And then next week, in the discussion about the election terrain, the ground on which we elect candidates from, the gerrymandering discussion gets us into using ranked choice, using another way to tally the ranked choice votes to get at what our commenter said was a better way to choose legislative officials, the proportional representation method, so that more voters have more power. The goal being, my goal, to come up with a nonpartisan method or a partisan neutral method of what's the best way to translate voter preference in large into elected representatives in a way that I would take regardless of what my politics are. I mean, the goal is my goal and the goal of election, fair election scientists is what's the way that you would accept as a fair method, even if it produces results not to your liking. That's where we want to go. So we're going to talk a little bit about that example, and then that'll motivate the discussion about, well, we should just get rid of ranked voting at all. And then I'm going to talk about why we shouldn't get rid of ranked voting, why we should implement it widely. And then next week, we'll talk about the real advantage, the super advantage of using that method of voting in every election. So let's take a break until 10 minutes after. Stretch your legs and get a drink of water or whatever. Thanks. I think we should start up again. I don't know how many times to say it. Carol, can we? Many are called, but few are chosen. And is everybody back online? I assume, I hope? Okay. So the motivation or the peg for the slide that's on the wall is on page 96 and 97. And I discovered over the break that we have a super guru mathematician in the audience who could help us go through that. But it's the contrived example that I was mentioning before. And as I say, the fact that it was contrived to make a point does not detract from the fact that it is an accurate and true point. It's just designed to show it in the smallest possible scale. It's sort of like a scale model where you emphasize certain features so that, everyone can see what's most important. And the bottom line is that you could have the same pool of voters with the same number of votes and their individual preferences in this body, and that shows up in that table. And that means that there's 45 who prefer the candidates in the order A, E, D, B, C. There's 22 who prefer them in the order B, D, E, C, A, and so forth. It is possible using fair election methods, and I should say the election method means how you count the votes. How you vote is how you mark your ballot. If we give this pool of voters a ranked ballot, and this is their preferences as expressed on their ballots, it is possible using fair methods with honest vote counters to end up with all 5 candidates winning the election differently. If you count them in one way, A wins. If you count using first past the post, A, who has the most first place votes, wins. If you count B, you can, if you use a primary, if you say this is a primary and then you count the votes again in a runoff style, you say B wins. And then if you use an instant runoff vote, then C wins, and then Borda is D. And if you use the Condorcet winner, I think Condorcet, yeah. Condorcet, the French mathematician, and sort of the Carnot of election methods, the E would be the Condorcet winner. So if using all 5 of these methods can produce a different winner from the same voting pool, maybe these aren't very good methods. Some people might conclude that. And there are, in fact, others who have said, you know, the problem is this imposing this ranking. And there's a better way to vote. And there, again, Americans have come up with another solution. And they've said, what if we just didn't make people rank their votes? What if we just said to them, make a check mark by all of the candidates that you approve of? And it's a neutral thing. You simply, if you could live with that person in office, you just put a check by their, so no matter how many candidates there are, you can approve of them. And if you count them up, the one with the most votes wins. That's approval voting. There comes to be some problems with that, and people end up saying, well, you know, I really like this person. I guess I could live with this person, and I want more. And so there's a technology, a wrinkle on approval voting called range voting, where instead of just checking, they let you give them a score from, let's say, 1 to 9. Or, you know, you could give, you know, any number between 1 to 9 to any candidate. And then you rank, you add up the votes and you compute an average ranking, and you say that the one with the highest average vote wins because they're the strongest. If you look over the whole pool, they had the highest, yeah, I wanted to say approval there, but that was the wrong word. Sam, have I done violence to those methods at all?
Oh, that's basically it, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of energy in I would say it's a small community of voting reformers, but they're highly energetic, advancing the idea that we should use approval voting and or range voting. And some of us here in Washington may be aware that there is a technology that Alaska has adopted. Do you know about that, Eleanor?
I lived there for a while, but I can't remember exactly what that was.
I believe Alaska is using top 4 or stars.
It's using a top 4, pick one primary, and then those 4 go into a ranked choice voting instant runoff general election.
So they didn't succeed in getting any approval voting into Alaska.
I don't think there was ever a campaign for that.
Is instant runoff synonymous with ranked choice?
I apologize. I've been using it that way, and it's not correct. Ranked choice is how you vote. Instant runoff is a method of counting votes. The predominant campaign for reform in this country that has brought so-called instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting to Maine, Oregon, Alaska, Minnesota, other states. There's a number of districts in California that are using it. Portland is now using a ranked choice ballot. Most of those for single member districts, they proposed to use the single transferable vote, which is now shorthanded to ranked choice voting. There's a comment online.
So we have from Celeste in Boulder, for range or score voting, think of giving a review on Amazon, 5 stars is best. Then Colorado and Idaho have the Alaska Final Four voting on their ballot this fall. Then Neil McBurnett from Boulder chimed in with, along with several other states, I think. And then Celeste replied to that. Arizona and Nevada are considering Final Five, I believe.
So these are other states who have looked at the experience in Washington and said that there's something to this idea of winnowing a huge field down, but top two is too much winnowing. And so they are moving forward with a couple of these states have adopted a system of essentially a primary to pick the top four who advance to a preference voting, instant runoff voting election. But remember, these are all for single winner seats. And next week, we're going to talk about legislative seats a little bit, which is where you seat many more than one. You could, you don't have to draw a single member district and only elect one person to each district. You can have, many states have had in their past, including Maryland, where I grew up, had multiple representatives elected identically from the same district so that it wasn't just the winner who got some representation, it was also the others. And I appreciate the clarification, the reminder, as Volić says, you've used approval voting all your life, and you've used, if you've ever done any online reviews for Amazon or any other product survey, satisfaction survey, were you happy with this service? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is a truncated form of score voting or range voting. They won't let you put 4.3. The mathematically pure forms of range voting let you put whatever numbers you want between the endpoints of the range. Amazon says you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stars. And then, of course, if you don't vote any stars at all, they can't tell whether you didn't care or were really unhappy and tried to give them a 0. I mean, that's the question about what does none of the above mean? Am I unhappy with the candidates, or do I hate the whole, do I hate the race, or what is it that you don't like? Why didn't you vote? We don't know. There's no way to know. At least without a express none of the above provision on the ballot. So what do you think? What are the comments? Sam is, I would presume, a somewhat advocate of at least score or approval, if not a score or range voting. Other people have thoughts about using those systems?
I think as a theory, approval voting makes sense. But practically speaking, I think it's too complex. I mean, there are some people now who say ranked choice voting is too complex. I just think that's my only comment. Practically speaking, I don't think it could ever get put into effect. It would never get voted in because people would object to the complexity of it.
So I should tell you that I believe it's St. Louis has in fact adopted approval voting. So it did get voted in at least one place. Possible there's more, I can't remember. But I'm interested in the idea that it's complex because it feels sort of simple. If you have a list of If you had a list of menu items when you went into a restaurant and you weren't sure which the chef was going to make that night, you might say, well, I could eat this one, this one, this one, this one, or this one. I don't want these, and I'm going to leave them alone. That seems simple to me. Is that the complexity?
Well, I haven't spent much time thinking about it, so I can't go very deep into it. But another thing that strikes me without having time to think in depth about it is, couldn't strongly partisan people just everybody agree, we're just going to check R1?
That is during the break that I had the discussion with Sam, that's exactly the point that I would make and that Volić makes about approval and score voting, is that it really works very well in low intensity low, I don't want to say low, pardon? Low polarization situations. I see the comment, Carbon, I'll get to it. Range and approval voting in practice among humans seems to resolve to plurality voting pretty quickly. Because where people are choosing what movie to watch, probably approval voting may be an ideal, and that maybe range voting is overly too much machinery for such a simple choice. But when it comes to dividing power in a democratic polity, people have rather intense involvement with that outcome, and the results of elections seem to suggest that there's an overwhelming urge among humans to bullet vote to ensure that my vote helped my most preferred candidate and did not in any way trigger any of the paradoxes that can fall prey. Approval voting is not perfect either. It has different weaknesses, but as Volić says, the more sophisticated form of approval voting, range voting, can even fail what many people might consider the most important criteria of majority preference, being elected. It's not going to be common, but it's something that people feel intensely about, and therefore bullet voting makes a lot of sense to humans. And if bullet vote, that's how we vote now, we bullet vote. We get to choose one, only one, and if you feel a pressure that your vote might help elect a less preferred candidate, you are highly likely, it seems, to bullet vote. That's probably the biggest issue with these non-ordinal systems, is that on paper, they mathematically pencil, but in partisan elections, they seem to not get us farther than we are today. It looked like you had a question, or?
Hills, and then I have.
Neil has a question?
So I'm going to ask Neil to unmute, and I'll have you state your thing, and then I'll get to Celeste's comments afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I love it when people, I mean, some people hate going in the weeds here, but it's very complicated, as you pointed out. So first, I just want to note that we could argue forever about the best way to elect a single winner, but none of them solve the gerrymandering problem, and they're complicated, and you can prove that they're, just can't find a good way to do it. So I hope that we get more conversation on the multi-winner approaches that I think the rest of the world uses, and really solve problems in a much more elegant way. And you've alluded to that. But in terms of what you've teed up here so far, I certainly find approval voting much less complex than instant runoff voting, which is the single winner form of ranked choice voting. Seattle voted for it, but their election officials can't implement it for several years. It takes serious equipment, it takes a lot of voter education, it takes just all kinds of things that they can't handle. And that's true in other places. Whereas St. Louis implemented approval voting in the space of a couple of months, because all you do is set it up exactly like a council election, where you can vote for multiple candidates. And you just say multiple means as many candidates as there are. There's no way to spoil your vote, your ballot in an approval voting election. You check off as many as you like, and they all count. Whereas there are many ways. People are extraordinarily creative at finding different ways to invalidate their ballots in any ranking method. I want to lift up star voting as another method that solves some of the few problems that people note with approval voting. It's a more complex ballot, but they're using that in some places in Oregon. So, but really proportional representation and multi-winner stuff is where it's at. And as I noted in the chat, the ranked choice method of multi-winner, there's an awful one in Utah. So like whenever you use the words RCV, you're lifting up a method that is anti-proportional in Utah. And it scares me to death that somebody, actually Maine used it once. You know, it's an easy thing to make a mistake around, and it's an awful approach. Whereas the single transferable vote, the multi-winner form that does get you proportional representation, is mathematically nearly impossible to audit because you don't even know like how you might have lost. It's very complicated, but my colleagues are experts in the field, and they've been trying it for years in Australia, and it's just a bear to audit. Anyway, it's more than you wanted to hear, but thanks.
Thank you. There was another comment?
They do not need to share, actually.
Okay, they've withdrawn that. So, Chris.
So on the range and score systems, there's one thing to consider, that what does a score of 4 mean to you versus me? And the fact is that being disaffected with elections can lower your, like basically the score you would give to a candidate, right? And that actually makes a difference when you are using scoring. The actual number, a 5 has more power than a 3 because it will give that person a higher score in the end, right? So the numbers really matter, and your feelings about what value you give to that number is actually subjective, right? It's what you say it's, right? So it is actually a really problematic system because people don't all give the same value to things like this, right? But when you rank them, you only ever have your ballot counted for the one candidate, right, in the end, as opposed to just using math to average all the scores of everybody who votes together to come up with a winner. So definitely some things to dig into there.
I'm going to let you and Glenn get together after the session, but if I can abstract a little bit and sort of dodge by saying I agree with you both that certainly I agree that the real problem is trying to elect a single winner for an inherently multi-winner situation. We could eliminate a ton of problems by getting away from the notion of that everybody in one geographic district can be represented by one person, since we know that by definition, that means that there were plenty of people who voted against that person who are supposedly represented by them. If we go to multi-member districts for legislative bodies, we can have majority rule with minority voice. And so everybody, or at least the greatest likelihood that the greatest number of people will feel that their vote helped elect somebody. That's the goal, to my mind. Your point about you really actually have to have social knowledge about should I just, if I'm going to use a range voting method, should I represent my favorite as a 9.99? Because, and that's where the tendency that I see and that Volić sees is to bullet vote. The simplification, the cognitive load is reduced dramatically if I simply say, well, I do have a favorite. I would rank this person first in a ranked ballot. I don't have a ranked ballot. I don't know what the rest of the electorate is going to do, so I'm going to bullet vote. And that seems to be a common result. Not saying it's the law, it's not a natural law, but it's how humans seem to behave when faced with a partisan election that they care a lot about. Somebody pass the mic to Sam. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Just really quick, going to get through some stuff in the chat. Celeste was saying that Fargo and St. Louis have approval voting. And would California and Washington prefer a top 2 approval voting election? Might it solve some of the top 2 problems? And then Celeste says, I've been told by approval voting advocates that only a few people have to vote for more than one to make it effective. That was in response to the fact that a lot of people would just bullet vote if they were very partisan. Neil McBurnett shares, the issue raised with score voting is resolved nicely by star voting's design. And then Celeste responded, the star voting score ballots recommend that you give your favorite the top score and your least favorite the lowest score.
And mathematically, what we end up doing is we sort of have a human nature problem here, which is that humans do have in a list of, I shouldn't say a list of choices, but in a menu of choices, people do have, rarely are they equal about a number of them. And the question is, how do we translate that individual preference into a vote? And then how do we translate all of those individual votes into a choice? And there's mathematical I don't want to say corner cutting because that sounds like I'm talking about cheating, but there's imprecision and there's different losses using different methods. Making those 2 translations of your personal feelings to a ballot, and then you're aggregating your ballot with many other people, an unknown number of other people's ballots. There is no mathematically, as Volić points out, there's no mathematically bulletproof method. There are better, and as you've seen from the debate here already, there are methods that are preferable on some aspects and, that have advocates. They all have advocates. They're all better than plurality. And there are defenders of plurality, but they're few and they're few on the ground. Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, I just wanted to make, I guess, a couple of points in support of approval voting, that the idea of simply indicating which of the candidates you like reasonably well and which you don't is a fairly simple thing and not too subject to this conniving of trying to change things somehow. As far as in practice what would happen, I can certainly see that if you have simply 2 parties or whatever and you ask people for approval, they're going to approve their party and they're not going to approve the others. And that may not be very effective. But if you used it for just the primaries within a party, for those states who have that procedure, and many do, then it would be reasonable, I think, for people to say, okay, there are 5 candidates who are running, maybe I'm a Democrat, and there are 5 Democrats running, and I can choose, 2 or 3 of them that I think are really good and align with me. I'll vote for those, and I'll not vote for the others. And that could be an effective way of then choosing the best person for the voters in that situation.
And you're implicitly assuming that each party nominates one, that advances one that using the approval voting in the primary then leads to a single winner of that race.
Right, if that's what they're doing, yeah.
I can't argue
yeah,
with you, except that my belief is kind of in agreement with you, except that I believe that people will then strategically vote based on their beliefs about the other parties, instead of you strategically voting based on your feelings about your party's candidates. You're going to be, I mean, in a sense, this is what a party should do, is say, what a primary should do is, what's the strongest candidate to beat the bad guys on the other side? And therefore, I'm not sure that you will get the neutral, yeah, I can tolerate these three, and the approval voting. I think it's a research question, and it's not a feeling.
An experimental one, yeah. Mathematically, I can show that you should vote for those who you rate above average. But in practice, what would happen?
What do humans do?
Right, that has to be done experimentally, and it would have to be done over a period of time, because people may do something different when they're first faced with a new system, and then they might adapt. We don't know.
Absolutely. And there's a comment online, I think.
Yeah, so Celeste from Boulder shares, a problem with various RCV methods is that the lower rankings are often invisible. If there are 4 candidates, more than half of the voters will get their first choice counted in the first round, and we will never see the lower rankings. Voters feel that they are most expressive in ranked voting, but so much of the voting data is hidden. In rating methods, like approval and score, none of the voting data is hidden. And then another comment, Celeste says, with ranking and approval, we have no way to know how much stronger a voter feels about the higher candidates or approved candidates. Score ballots have the most expressive nuance of the 3 types of ballots: ranking, approval, and score.
Making my point for me that all of the methods have advocates and, reasonable arguments for their use. I mean, you've just heard several commenters, including, here in the room, thoughtfully saying why one method appeals to them more than another, and their beliefs about how others would perceive the same ballot. That's why this should be a live issue. One of the major problems I want to bring home to you is that we in Washington State are being punished. We are not allowed to have this conversation. We have a law that says how you will do elections, even if you had a city council or a county council or a port district who thought that it was important to use a better election system than plurality. We have no local control of elections here. So we're not able to build the experiment that Sam is talking about. We can't use, until we get local control, the local options bill, to allow us to have municipalities, cities, counties, port districts, school boards, until we get the control and the ability of those governments to use a better way or to experiment and see if it's a better way, we have a problem because we're locked into top 2. And top 2 is a more expensive form of plurality that seems to lead to more extremism. What we have seen in Washington since top 2 is that a polarized society has become progressively more and more polarized, and the primaries are leading to more extreme candidates rather than more moderate candidates. Goldwater said extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, but we are coming to a politics that is almost toxic at this point, and it is concerning. So It's about 10 minutes till, or a little bit. I wanted to try to wrap up and sort of reorganize and try to make myself more prepared for next week by laying out again what I've tried to say, again, assuming that people here have read this book or at least dipped into this book. Chapters 1 through 6 are the guts of the 7th chapter, where he says, he makes a conclusion about voting methods that a number of people here might disagree with. He says, I think we should use ranked choice voting. And by that, he means the single transferable vote. I go along with that, although I am not unaware that single transferable vote, ranked choice voting, is not a flawless system. Most of my motivation around that is anything's better than what we have. And what we really should seek is improvement. We have a long history with the preference voting, and it is on the rise in the United States. And if we move away from plurality, the simplest thing to do is to go to single winner races like governors, executive offices, using the instant runoff voting form of ranked choice voting, and what I'll call the full representation form for multi-member districts. And that's where I want to get to next time. And that's the second half of the book. And if you only read a little, it would be chapters 12 and 13, which talks about the issues of, the gerrymander. I mean, most of the rest of the book is confronted with the issues of the Electoral College and the gerrymander. And I'm not going to take on the Electoral College. The League of Women Voters has a lot of good work over decades saying this is a problem. We nearly had it fixed in the late 60s. We almost had it, but it slipped away. And I don't know when in this polarized environment we'll ever be able to actually get rid of the Electoral College outright. But what we can do is, in millions of other elections, we can have a better system that leads to less toxic polarization and more people feeling like their vote made a positive difference, and that led to representation. With that, I'm going to stop and ask for questions or comments, and give other people a chance to make a comment to motivate people to do the reading and address for next week. Eleanor.
I can't leave the room until I get this straight, so please help out here. As I was reading through those first chapters, I was having a little difficulty trying to understand what was the test to throw it out or not throw it out. And then finally, I saw these 4 items: vote splitting, spoiler effect, monotonicity, and the last one looks like a
irrelevance of independence alternatives.
Yeah. And so then I was trying to, in my mind's eye, as I went through the different methods, then I was looking for a discussion of those 4 and why would it. And is that what you did as an exercise, or some of the mathematicians here in the room did as an exercise to understand the terminology a little better? Were you using those 4 measurements or those 4 criteria?
No, used those plus the other ones. As you may note that he says, here are 4, but this is in addition to the other ones we've talked about, which is the idea of the majoritarian rule, which he doesn't list there. what you basically could do, if you want to get really recursive and, stare at your own navel a little bit, is you could say, well, we should have a vote for which criteria should we evaluate our election systems on. And different what the exercise was meant to do was to show you that different methods that are all honest, they're all fair, they operate fairly under their rules, can lead to different outcomes. And his examples in chapters 2 through 5 show that they all can produce seemingly paradoxical results. The monotonicity problem should, your gut should tell you that more votes should never hurt a candidate. And it turns out that because of the way we aggregate votes, if you're eliminating candidates by rounds, more votes for one can pathologically hurt them, right? That's a problem. This goes to the issue of, again, do we have an election to decide which criteria do we want to optimize? Arrow's theorem, which he talks about in the book and then he later renames, basically says there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. There ain't no such thing as a perfect election system. Have you ever heard the phrase that the map is not the terrain? The only perfect map of the world is the world. Any map of the world is omitting some information and it's simplifying things wrongly and it's throwing out valuable information. In a way, an election system, we can probably perfectly list your preferences among any menu of choices, but as soon as we try to roll your choices in with the choices of everybody else and only produce one outcome, we're going to have error. And that's really the mathematical answer, or the summary, that's the verbal summary of your question, which is there is no perfect translation of a group preference to a choice. Even the non-ordinal methods, the range and approval voting can lead to paradoxical results or dysfunctional, non-desired behavior of reducing back to plurality, for example. That I didn't sit down and through. I've been working through this stuff for a long time, and I was familiar with those. I would be interested to know if there were any novices here who actually found, who worked through the examples, because each one is designed to show you the paradox of that method. Did anybody do that?
I took it on faith.
Well, and I really think Volić did a good job in this book. I believe, maybe because I am inclined to believe him because I liked his result. I mean, I have tried to figure out, did I like this book because I liked his answer, or did I like his book? I think I liked the book and I liked him. Comment online.
Yes, Neil McBurnett from Boulder shares, for a sense of how complex the auditing of STV is, multi-winner proportional RCV, see the best they've done, which can only handle two winner contests. RLAs for 2-seat STV elections revisited, and then there's a link here. In contrast, it is easy to audit proportional approval voting, according to Philip Stark, the inventor of risk-limiting audits.
So, again, knowledgeable people who have worked hard and spent a lot of time in paper have a criteria that's very important to them, and it leads them to prefer one method to another. So what I heard in Glenn's comment was, because of this auditing question, which is a criteria for evaluating an election system, you should prefer this method to that method. He may be right. I don't know that there is a should prefer, but the comment about the difficulty of auditing an election is well taken. I mean, it's a fair point. People need to feel that the election, that, it's not just a black box. So whether or not open source software and, paper ballots, I believe the auditing question is solvable, but if you are of a mind that you need to be skeptical at every stage to the nth degree, auditing can become very important because we are dividing power here, right? So I just hear in the comment a well-stated case for this criteria is superior for these methods. If that is the criteria that is most important to you, then probably your ranked preferences for methods of voting might come out with those methods on top. And other methods might be unacceptable because of the auditing question. There are a number of criteria for, as I said, I believe there are probably advocates for plurality because it's simple. It's what everybody knows how to do. And, we should just get over it. Last comment, go ahead.
I believe this was just a clarification. Neil says, this is assuming we trust the paper and have open source software. We still don't know how much sampling to do for STV.
Yeah, a further clarification on, if you're choosing a method based on auditability and that is your primary criteria, you will probably reach a different conclusion than someone else might. It is a criteria that you should evaluate on. Let's meet again next week at 6 o'clock, and we'll have what I hope is a more, I don't want to say constructive, but in less critical discussion, in the sense of I feel very critical about plurality. I feel very, very critical about the inability to experiment with better election methods in Washington state, whether those be score, range, ranked choice voting, or whatever. And I want to share what the evangelicals call the good news that Glenn has alluded to several times and that I would allude to, which is, turns out that in most of the world, they don't have this kind of toxic politics, and they don't have what our system really falls prey to, which is tiny changes in the vote leading to radical changes in outcomes in terms of election results. Our winner-take-all single-member system gives a tiny handful of voters in a tiny handful of places inordinate power to change the course of history. I remember looking at 1994, 19,000 votes brought changed the House of Representatives wildly in a country of 300 million people. And that's not democratic.
As long as you've got a two-party system. And that's always going to be true.
Let's tune in next week. Thank you, everybody.
Repeat the chapters that people should definitely read.
If you're not going to read it all, if you're not going to read every word, I would certainly read 12 and 13. And the solution of proportional representation.
So I should mention that